Thanks for joining me today for a virtual program all about mason bees. We'll talk about what a mason bee is, how we can tell a mason bee from other bees, and we'll even make a home for them to put in our own backyards. Let's get started. The first thing I want you to do is think about bees and make a guess of how many different types or species of bees you think we have in our state of Illinois. So take a moment, think about it, and make a guess. If you guessed between 400 and 500 species or types of bees, you are correct. That's a huge number of different types of bees just in Illinois, just in our state. So you can imagine how many thousands of different types of bees we have across the United States and then even further across the whole world. So there's a huge amount of diversity or different types of bees. But when we say the word bee, usually one type comes to mind. And that would be the honeybee. So honeybees are super important to our food crops. They are very important pollinators, but they are not the only bees that do really important work. And it's important that we learn about these other bees because honeybees are actually not from the US. So they were brought over to the US from Europe by humans to help with pollination and with honey production. But that technically means that they're non-native species. So they're not from the US originally. Now, being a non-native species isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes we forget about those native bees that we have here also that are playing an important role. So we're going to focus on the native bees today. When we talk about native bees, those are bees that have lived here in the US, or today we're talking about Illinois. They've lived here for hundreds of thousands of years. And that means that they've been able to evolve or change over time and adapt to the environment as it has changed over time. That means that they're really well suited to the environmental conditions of our area, and they're adapted to feeding off of and living around the plants that we also have growing here natively in Illinois. When we talk about native bees, remember there are hundreds of different types or species of them. We can group them into groups to make it easier, but there's still a bunch of groups. So I listed just a few here. Mason bees we're talking about today. Other native bees are leafcutter bees, mining bees, cuckoo bees, bumblebees, which you may have heard of before, and sweat bees. In the pictures, I have a leafcutter bee on top and a sweat bee on the bottom that's really green and metallic in color. How can we tell a mason bee apart from these other bees? Well, mason bees are really dark in color. They're green to blue to black and kind of metallic looking. But unlike that sweat bee that was green and metallic, mason bees are really hairy. So hopefully in the top photo you can see these yellow to black long hairs that cover the mason bee. So if we looked at that bee, first of all, you might not recognize it as a bee at first glance because it doesn't have that yellow and black striping that we're used to seeing, but that is in fact a bee, and it's an easy way to tell the mason bee apart from some of our other bees. An interesting fact about mason bees is that they are solitary bees. That means that they live by themselves. They don't like to live in a community with other bees, but prefer to live on their own. They also are cavity nesters, so that means that they're going to find small openings to make their nest in. You can see how they're doing that in those wooden tubes in the photo, and that's the type of nest or home that we're going to provide for them. They also carry their pollen like a fanny pack. So unlike other bees that have pollen baskets on their legs, mason bees, when they visit a flower to drink up nectar and they're gathering pollen, the hairs on their belly or their abdomen is what collects the pollen. So I like to say that it's like their pollen is being carried in a fanny pack on their belly. They're also active in the spring and early summer, so we are making our mason bee home right at the right time where they should be out and about right now outside. When it comes to food, mason bees drink up nectar from native flowers. I have a couple examples on the screen, a golden Alexander's and a wild geranium. These are just two examples of native plants that mason bees will visit for nectar. When we talk about mason bee shelter, remember they like to nest in hollow cavities or openings. So that could be something like a plant stem or a hole in wood or the mason bee home that we're going to make today. Let's take a look inside one of these nests. Here you can see that a mason bee has made different cells, like different rooms, inside that hole in the wood. And in each of those cells, it's deposited an egg. And it uses mud and leaves and sand and gravel to build and form those cells around each individual egg. So this just gives us a bird's eye view inside of what a mason bee nest looks like. Okay, now it's time for our activity, and we are going to make our own mason bee home to encourage mason bees to nest in our backyards. So before we get started, let's make sure we have all of the supplies that we need. The first thing we need is a waterproof container, and we really want this container to be at least 6 inches tall. Now with this tall aluminum can, I'm right at about 5.5 inches, but I'm going to use it because I'm pretty close. But you could use an empty soda bottle that we cut the top off of, or a half-gallon milk carton that you cut the top off of. So be creative, try and find a small waterproof container that's at least 6 inches tall. We're also going to need brown construction paper, lots of brown construction paper, and clay if you have it. If you don't, we can just use tape. We also have instruction sheets that you can follow along with. And then we'll need some other things like scissors, tape, a ruler, and a pencil. So go ahead and make sure you gather your supplies before we move on with our activity. Our first step is to take our brown construction paper and to cut it into smaller pieces. So we need our pieces to be about 3 inches wide and 7 inches tall. So it helps to use your ruler and to trace out those pieces on your construction paper, and then you can cut them out from there. I was able to get 4 pieces on my construction paper, and I needed about 40 pieces of paper to fill my container with tubes. Depending on the size of your container, you might need fewer or more. Once you've cut out your pieces of paper, you're going to roll each individual piece of paper around a pencil to form a tube. That will make tubes that are about 7 inches long and about 8 millimeters wide. You don't need to measure how wide they are. As long as you're wrapping your pieces of paper tightly around your pencil, you should be good to go. Secure your rolled pieces of paper with 2 pieces of tape so that it doesn't unroll. And then we need to close off one end of the tube. We're going to leave the open end near the open end of our container, but on the closed side of our container, we want those tubes to be closed off as well. So there's 2 ways to do this. If you have natural clay, you could put a piece of clay on one end to plug that end, or you can simply fold it over and secure that end with tape. Once you have rolled up and secured all of your tubes, you can place them into your container. and then you can take your container and put it somewhere outside. So it's best if you can have your container facing south or southeast, and depending on where you want to put it, you can secure it in different ways. So you can secure it to a tree. If you had some twine or rope, you could just wrap tightly around your home and the tree to secure it. In this picture, you can see that they used a material that they wrapped around half of the home, and then they used screws to screw it into this wooden area outside. That's another option. So just see what types of materials you have at home and where you want to place your bee home. So what to do next? Take your bee home and hang it outside, either at home or at your school. Check it to see if you have bees that are nesting inside. So you'll see that the tube will be closed off at the front if you do have a bee come and nest inside. See if you can take pictures of bees coming in and out. And then make sure that every year you replace the tubes inside. So just like we need to clean our home every now and then, mason bees also need a clean place to nest. So we need to take all our tubes out, get rid of them, sanitize our container, and replace with new tubes each year. Some other ways that you can help bees are by planting native plants in your home or at your school. And you can also try making other bee homes. So this is just one way to make a bee home. You can make another one, or you could try different ways. So there's another way where you drill holes out of a wood block. So with an adult's help, you might want to try making that type of bee home as well. That's all for today's virtual program on mason bees. Thank you so much for joining me, and good luck. I hope that you're able to see some bees come to your bee home.